would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work, the Gundungurra land and people. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I also want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which you, our listeners, are joining us from today. I recognise the deep connection that First Nations people have to this land, their enduring culture, and their commitment to the preservation and care for their country. This land was never ceded, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Hey there, and welcome to Beyond the Surface, the podcast where we explore the stories of people who have survived religious trauma, left high control or cult communities, and are deconstructing their faith. I'm your host, Sam, and each week I'll talk with individuals who have taken the brave step to start shifting their beliefs that might have once controlled and defined their lives. Join us as we dig into their experiences, the challenges they've faced, and the insights they've gained. Whether you're on a similar journey or you're just curious about these powerful stories, you're in the right place. This is Beyond the Surface. Welcome, Brady. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you. It's so good to be here.
Before we kick in, where in the world are you?
I am in pretty much the center of the United States in Southwest Missouri.
Okay.
Most people know Kansas City, so I'm pretty close to
Mm-hmm.
there. Yeah.
Nice. What's the weather like there at this time of year? Like we're recording in
Uh,
November.
yeah, it's usually a little colder than it has been lately.
Oh,
So, yeah, it's been moderately warmer for the time of year, but still getting like our fall season starting a little bit colder, which is nice. Yeah.
nice. Okay, so I like to start these episodes with a super vague, super broad question, which is
Love it.
where does your story start?
I really feel like I have two stories. I really feel like I have like the first part of my life and then like the more recent stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I mean just like a brief summary, it's a pretty typical like Midwest white evangelical heterosexual, like when you imagine your little church kid that was raised and like grew up in it, like there's really not a whole lot of the first part of my story that's going to be surprising or unfamiliar to many people. Um, Other than the fact that maybe it's just, boring. So, um, but like I picked up all of the stuff. I picked up all of the evangelical and just religious fervor and traditions and just your typical like conservative family in the middle of the United States. So
Mm.
Um, that was kind of like the background. Um, but it really, really changed several years ago when things just kind of like fell apart.
Mm.
And the falling apart was absolutely insane, but so beautiful and like has really has really inspired me to like, I don't know, just it has been a pretty much a 180. Like everything has been completely different. Spent years challenging everything that I've ever thought and finding out what I still think is worth believing in and what I don't. So,
It's quite the process, hey?
yes, very much so.
If we sort of go back to the family that you were raised in and that sort of very conservative evangelical life, was this the beliefs of your family or did it become the beliefs of yourself? Or like, because often being raised in the family doesn't necessarily mean that it becomes personal for us.
Yeah. So I've actually talked about this a little bit and I've articulated or formulated my opinion on this pretty extensively. And that is that as a child, there was no doubt in my mind that any deviation from the accepted belief system in my family would have
Mm,
resulted in a risk to the attachment that I had with my parents.
yeah.
And so I can definitely say it was my family's beliefs, but it became mine because I didn't think there was actually another choice
Mm,
or that the other choice would have cost me relationship with my parents. And as a kid, like you have to have you need your parents.
yeah.
So Like, what choice is that actually?
Yeah. Yeah, I have a gripe with people who say that their children, when they're like 7 or 8 or even like 10 and 11, are like accepting Jesus, because I'm kind of like, well, no, they're just accepting they're accepting a one solution thing. There's not
Yeah.
the cognitive or the brain development at that age to be able to think anything else other than just staying safe with the primary attachment figures that are in your world. So
Yeah.
um, it's a personal little gripe that I have in that space. How did that shift and change as you got older, though?
Yeah. So I think I definitely did transition into a period where even though it didn't feel like I necessarily had empowered consent to partake in this particular set of beliefs, I do feel like eventually it did translate into wanting to be genuine, wanting to be authentic in my pursuit of this, this God that I was hearing about. And maybe the motivations were still acceptance from friends and family, but at the end of the day, I do know that my heart was genuine in seeking a relationship with this God that everyone had talked about and had made life all about. And so I think throughout like my teenage years, um, it was a lot of um, kind of chasing what was popular.
Mm,
So like, some of the things like Acquire the Fire, that was a really big one. I did YWAM, which was
mm,
the, Youth with a Mission. Um, I did, was even involved a little bit with IHOP KC, which is like
mhm.
crazy right now. And
Yeah.
so it really was kind of like where's the place that you go so that you can have the ultimate experience in the
Mm,
Christian faith as you know it.
yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, again, like I knew my heart was genuine, but it was still chasing a lot of things that people put in front of you.
Mm. What was the God that you were presented with, and how did you relate to them?
Um, yeah, I mean, it's a very, I mean, it's the biblical evangelical version of this deity that um really, thinking back now to it, was really a narcissist in the sense that it was very much all about um, sacrificing and letting go of this life in order for the next. And if you do it wrong, well, you get to spend the rest of your life burning in eternal conscious torment. And so, yeah, I mean, I mean, I hate to be like boring, but it was your very stereotypical Christian evangelical God. Like, there's
Yeah.
very little deviation.
Mm. I mean, I guess I ask that question because, often, we have the idea that we are created in the image of God and that, we are an extension of who that is. And so I guess, how did the God that you were presented with impact on how you viewed yourself?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, that's essentially it has led to a lifelong journey of shame.
Mm,
Um, because the experience is that not only was I born evil, but left to my own desires, I would always choose the evil thing.
yeah.
And so I'm just inherently bad all the time. And unless I discipline and essentially, you know, I mean, there was all the things. There was like accountability part, like
Yeah.
everything was just like all about this idea of if we leave Brady alone for just a second, this guy's going to end up going to hell. Like that was like how all of this was structured. And so, really the way it impacted my life was that I had to figure out how I could endlessly bleed for this God so that maybe I would be good enough.
Mm,
And that's a really hard way to live because um, there's always the crazy thing about it is there will always be somebody else somewhere that will tell you you're doing it wrong, no matter what you're actually doing. Like it doesn't actually matter.
yeah.
And so as good as you think you could ever be in the faith, there will always be someone that is challenging you to do better or that if you don't do it a certain way, you're not living out the call God has for you or whatever like phraseology that was used. But yeah. So yeah, I mean the whole life was basically just like I suck and I just have to like keep beating myself up to do better.
Yeah. The amount of times I heard the phrase die to self is just like insanity. Like it was just it's insanity. But you're right, in some way, like you are never going to please everybody, right? You're never going to do it right in the eyes of everybody. It reminds me of there's an artist, Candy Carpenter. I don't know if you know who that is, but anyway,
Sounds familiar.
she has an album that's about her own deconstruction and growing up as a pastor's kid. And one of the lines in her song is "Everybody goes to hell in someone else's religion." And
Mm.
it's
Yeah.
I love it because it kind of puts things into perspective that you are never going to be all right with everybody.
Yeah.
It's someone's going to see it as wrong. Someone's going to see it as not okay. How did that impact, I guess, that view of self? How did that impact on relationships and friendships and how you related to people in general?
Yeah. No, it actually became this obsession with proving my value, proving my worth. Um, I'm not sure if you're into Enneagram at all, but
Mm,
I am an Enneagram 2, which is the
nice.
helper, right? Um, Essentially, it was like it's such a bad combination to be in that type of religion and then also be an Enneagram 2, because essentially what that looked like is that I was literally purchasing any sort of value or love from anybody that would give it to me by being endlessly sacrificial and helpful to everyone around me.
Yeah.
Um, and the church really did actually prey on that because, um, I used to get like these like I don't know what to call them awards, but I would get recognition at church for serving as often as I did.
Mm,
And so to me, it was like I don't know, just like one little token in the belt for the fact that I had some value somewhere.
yeah.
Um, I didn't realize that it was really extremely superficial and came crashing down very easily. But yeah, I mean, in friendships and I mean, I was constantly the pursuer. I was constantly chasing down people. And instead of just saying, hey, I would like a friend, I would say, hey, how can I help?
Yeah.
And tried to purchase my friendship that way. It was like, it basically set me up for a lifestyle of me consistently giving 100 or even 110% to any relationship or organization and hope that I get 20 to 30% back.
Mm,
And so it was an incredibly lopsided relationship. It was very transactional too.
mm,
Um, it was like, what have you done for me lately?
mm,
And so, and then it also, unfortunately, really got everyone used to the level of engagement that I would have.
mm.
And so it was extremely hard to come back down from that because the second that I actually tried to do less, everyone's like, "What's wrong? Why are you upset?" Or you know what I mean? So it just felt like a really big trap. It felt like prison for sure.
Yeah. It's like it's almost like a you set this unrealistic standard based on, that tr the notion of transactional belonging, I think is just, something that comes out of, post-church people or
Yeah,
those who are deconstructing because it is about your usefulness as opposed to you. And it's a really I mean, it's a really fucked up notion that like it's not about who you are, it's about what you can give to us, what you do for us, how useful are you for us.
yeah,
And that's exhausting for the person who is doing it.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think what makes it worse too is that it was always, I mean, I guess it was a form of gaslighting, but it was never for the organization or for the person. It was always for the kingdom
Yeah.
or, for like, so it was constant, it was a life of reframe is
Mm,
really what it was.
yeah.
And so, the church could need help doing this, but the communication would be, um, hey, have you thought about more ways that you can serve the church? Because that's what, so it's just, yeah, toxic as fuck. I don't know how else to
Yeah.
say it.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, from hearing from everybody that I've ever spoken to around this topic, often when it's framed as, advancing the kingdom or you're doing it for the glory of God and all of this sort of language, it leaves you no room for movement because you're supposed to be grateful for this level of exhaustion because it's what you've been called to do. And so
Yeah.
it's like this really awful cycle of I can't feel guilty about not wanting to do the thing.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, I think the worst part too is then you end up watching other people around you do it as well.
Yeah.
And so then it just feels like it's more abnormal not to do it
Mm.
than it is to do it. So yeah, it's definitely that part of my life, that part of the journey and the season of just endless sacrifice. It was, I guess I just didn't realize until several years later just how
Mm.
incredibly harmful and how empty and spent I was all the time.
Yeah. What impact, I mean, I'm sort of thinking, being a therapist, I'm automatically going to what sort of impact did that have on you? Because, like, spiritual burnout is real for people in church environments and in religious environments. And
Yeah.
the impact I would imagine that that level of exhaustion is going to have on you mentally and physically. What was that like for you to sort of like be coming out of that?
Well, a little bit of because there's a little bit of a season like before I exited
Mm,
that I've thought about a lot and looking back into just what that experience was like. And I think it's always, I mean, retrospect is always so much easier, right? But just looking at that season, I cannot believe just how out of control and miserable I actually felt.
yeah.
Um, just because it was like um I don't know, there were definitely moments where I felt so desperate
Mm,
and just so like, will anybody see this? Like, is
mm,
anybody going to notice the fact that I am literally suffering?
mm,
And I was a pretty prominent figure in a pretty large church, and so it was like yeah, I had that like idea that if anyone was going to be noticed in their suffering, I thought I had a pretty good chance of it.
yeah.
But because of the fact that there's all this reframe that's going on. There's all this like, well, and then of course the church, the response to stuff like this is, hey, we need to get this as quiet and as hidden as possible because we can't let anybody else know that this can happen.
Mm,
And so then it was like the church was actively trying to suppress my own suffering,
mm,
um, which was even more harmful. So yeah, before the exit, I would just say the impact was just like desolation. It
yeah.
was like mental and emotional desolation.
Mm,
Um, I don't think I'd ever felt more alone. And then there was like the feelings of being used.
yeah.
Um, and yeah, I mean, I was just so surprised. I think I can't ever get over the fact that I was like, man, I just spent years giving in excess, giving in an entirely out of proportionate amount. And if there was ever a moment where I really just needed help or like needed
Mm,
um, empathy or needed some level of compassion, it almost felt like it was like, well, I earned it. Like I earned it, right? Like it's not too much to ask for, right? But then like there was nothing.
yeah.
And so yeah, that was the season right before exiting was definitely the more significant and the hard part. I mean,
Mm,
it was all difficult. Exiting was like I think I had already accepted the abandonment, the loneliness, the despair. Like I already accepted it before I ever left. So leaving was just kind of like a whatever, like I'm done. Like I'd already gotten there mentally and emotionally. So,
mm,
but yeah, it was pretty it was pretty tragic.
yeah. I mean, even the like as you were talking, I'm even thinking even like the notion that you need to earn compassion from people is just like
Hmm.
awful. Outside of the fact that like you are in a space that is supposed to bleed compassion for people, right? Like that's what it's supposed to look like. um, but it doesn't. And I mean, what impact did the lack of support, the lack of compassion that you got from the leaders and the people around you, what impact did that have on how you related to God during that time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I just shut it all off, to be honest.
Mm,
And not to bunny trail too much here, but it was already a season of incredible change.
mm,
Um, I'd also left my marriage at the same time.
okay.
I'd also gotten a new job.
A lot of
So,
change in one hit.
um, yeah, it was like if you can think of all of the like qualifying life events, I just did them all in like 2 months.
Mm,
So when I left, I pretty much just left everything. Like I left I mean, I'm in a small Midwestern town. I shouldn't say small. It's smaller. And so everyone goes to
mm,
one of like two or three churches. And the community was just like built to encourage cross church um, communication. And anyway, so when I left, it was like I left every friendship. I left my marriage. I left my job. I left any sense of real purpose in spirituality. Um, I mean, it was like everything was just gone overnight.
yeah.
And so when it came to relationship with God in that moment, I just threw him into the bunch. I was like, listen, you may or may not be who I thought you were, but that doesn't really matter right now. Like if I'm gonna take this thing all the way down to the foundation, if I'm gonna like wipe it all clean, like you're going to.
Yeah.
And so it was probably, I don't know, probably 6 months before I even contemplated what I thought my spirituality was or my religion beliefs system should like turn into. Like
Mm,
I literally I didn't wrestle. I like literally just gave up and threw it all away.
mm. I mean, it sounds like you didn't have any energy to do anything else.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and that was the other thing too, is like I kind of just I was like reclaiming bits and pieces that I didn't think I was allowed to have during the season prior. And one of those things was I just wanted to actually suffer. Like I actually just wanted to go through it.
Yeah.
And so I think there was parts of it where I had heard about this God being compassionate and that he cared and loved me. And I was like, I actually don't even want that right now. Like right now, I actually just want to suffer. I want to be as alone and as miserable as I can be
Mm,
because I have spent, months and months and months pretending that I wasn't.
yeah. I think people sometimes don't necessarily realize the spiritual bypassing that happens in churches where
Mhm.
you are actually like not allowed to feel what is happening in your internal landscape because unless it serves the purpose of the church, it doesn't serve a purpose, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, we've talked about this on my own podcast as well, and it's a systematic separation
Mm,
from everything that makes you you. And
yeah.
they do that by saying things like, well, your heart is deceitful above all else. We all know that one.
Yeah.
Your body is not your own. It's a temple or it belongs to your spouse, whichever way you want to, whichever verse you want to use.
Hmm.
Um, his thoughts are higher than yours, so you can't even trust what you're thinking about things. And so
Hmm.
there's just this systematic separation of anything that makes me me. And so like what do I have left? If
Yeah.
I'm divorced from all of those things, what do I have?
Mm. What was that? You sort of said that there was around 6 months before you even started to contemplate anything around spirituality. What was that 6 months like for you?
Um, it was rough.
Mm.
Uh, it was it was just this like constant waking up and feeling like, is this actually my reality?
Yeah.
And so there was just a lot of bewilderment at
Mm.
the fact that I was even in this place and that I had had this experience. Um, of course, there was a few like, hey brother, can we go get coffee this week? Like there were a few of those, and I didn't know any better, so I went to a few of them. And then I would like get home from coffee and be like, I'm like sitting here trying to figure out if they're just choosing to not understand or if they're willfully ignorant, or like it was so hard to figure out
Mm.
why no one was noticing what was happening. Um, but yeah, it was definitely, I wouldn't trade it for anything. Like I'm so glad that that season happened, but it was also one of the more miserable times I've been in life. And so yeah, I'm so thankful that I chose to do the suffering,
Mm.
as hard as it was, just because it was also some level of freedom to finally, like, that's really what started the reclamation and the reconnection with me and myself. And so, yeah, if it wasn't for that season, I mean, I don't think things would have ever gotten any better, but it was obviously a pretty detrimental and miserably lonely experience.
Yeah. What did you learn about yourself during that 6 months?
It is so much. Uh, yeah. Um, yeah, there was a lot. Actually, the really beautiful part about this, and it's really kind of like why I do the work that I do with Love Like a Heretic, and um, it's really been probably one of the most formative parts of my journey, is that there were I wouldn't say quite a few. There were a few significant people that showed up in that season
Mm.
that were outside of the church already. Um, some had either already completed their own version of deconstruction, some never grew up in the church. Probably not surprisingly, quite a few members of the queer community, obviously, because like I think whenever you're in the queer community, you like recognize the type of, um, you know, abandonment. Like you can just see it on somebody's face. You're like, I get it, I know.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, there was a few people that were like showing up, and there were just these little like tastes of the compassion that I thought the church was supposed to bring. And it was coming from like ironically, some of the most like compassionate moments I had in that season. I started playing music again, and so I went and played with a friend at a Pride festival.
Mm.
First time I'd ever been to a Pride festival, and there was just this level of acceptance and compassion there, even being a straight person, that I did not expect. I had no um, foresight that anywhere on the horizon that there would be this level of love and compassion and acceptance.
Mm.
If anything, I felt like I was going from a place that didn't want me to a place that didn't need me. And
Mm.
so I was like, you know, um,
Yeah.
and so yeah, I encountered these like moments of compassion from people, and I was like, oh, hold on, like there's actually parts of this that don't feel in conflict with Jesus, the
Mm.
one that I grew up with. It just feels conflictual with the church.
Mm.
And so then that sent me into this whole tailspin of like, how can people be loving me like Jesus did, but not have any church affiliation or religious belief?
Yeah.
And so, that obviously started this whole like, oh my God, maybe the Bible doesn't own moral authority. Like, so yeah, it was
Yeah.
wild. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah. I mean, like, what was it like for you to start unraveling, I guess, the the actual spiritual biblical component of deconstruction of like, oh shit, maybe like the Bible is not the inerrant word of God. Like maybe sin is a whole load of horseshit and maybe hell doesn't exist and like all of
Mhm.
those huge existential questions that conjure an emotive reaction in us because we've been taught one way about
Yeah.
them. What was it like for you to start pulling on that thread?
Yeah. I will say the very first thing, um, like what I would say after a couple of months, I felt like the whole thing just needed to be thrown out the window. Like I didn't want any of it. I had zero tolerance for anything that I had learned. I was done.
Mm.
But the first thing to go was, I heard, I don't remember who it was at this point, but someone was talking about the idea that hell doesn't exist.
Mm.
And I was like, and I started thinking about it. I was like, I would have so much less of a problem with Christianity if hell didn't exist. Because that was really the hard part for me, especially as a father.
Mm,
because I had this moment where I was like, someone was talking to me about this, and I was like, okay, if one of my kids, I got a 12-year-old, she's amazing, so smart, so brilliant, um, just very strong-willed. I love her to death. But I was like, okay, if she murdered somebody like
mm,
tomorrow, um, how would I show up as a father? Like, what would be my response to her murdering someone?
mm.
Um, Obviously, there would be tremendous heartbreak
Yeah.
and tremendous grief. And um, I would definitely be incredibly concerned with who she is as a person.
Mm,
But as a father, my reaction is like, does she deserve punishment? Yeah.
mm,
Like I don't have a problem with her like doing some time in prison. Like you probably should do that when you kill somebody. Like now, will I be there every opportunity that I can visit? Yeah. Like I'm still gonna want to like I want to have her in my life. I still want to like know how she's doing and I still care about her and love her. But yeah, I get that like, hey, there's consequences, and if you murder somebody, you might have to go spend the rest of your life in jail.
mm,
And so, but for me to be able to sit there and think, and one of the worst things I think you could do on this planet
mm,
leaves me still wanting connection,
mm.
leaves me still wanting to know you.
Yeah.
And so to then try to translate into if I'm a half decent father and God is supposed to be the best father,
Mm,
there is no space for me to ever believe that no matter what I do on earth, that he would ever want to actually strictly enforce eternal conscious torment
yeah.
forever.
Mm,
Like it just like I would want my kid to have the consequence and pay the price, but not for eternity.
mhm.
And
Yeah.
so that was kind of like the big thing. The second that I was like, man, Christianity is actually somewhat tolerable if hell doesn't exist. But
Mm,
then like if you can get past that, and the first thing I did was I started like, I did all this Googling and like looking up like and I to my surprise, I was like, oh my God, there's actually quite a few theologians that are very popular household names if you've ever gone to Bible school or anything, and like these people didn't believe in hell. And I'm like, wait, what? So like this is actually not a new belief. Like we didn't just like get to 20, I don't know, 2010 and be like, hey, maybe hell doesn't exist. No, it's actually been something that we've debated and argued about for 2000 years.
yeah.
And some might even say it wasn't even really that prevalent until eighth or ninth century. So like it's kind of essentially a new construct. And so once I
Mm,
got past that and realized I wasn't alone in thinking that maybe it doesn't exist, um, that just kind of opened up a whole new world of things. Because then I
mm,
was like, okay, well, if hell doesn't exist, then it all of a sudden takes everything that I thought was a sin and completely like
mm,
it removed my desire to like want separation from whatever that was.
mm.
And so like, then it just became an issue of morality. Like, do I agree that that's a good decision or not? Instead of, hey, if you do this, you're gonna go to hell. Like, so like the weight of things was obviously had changed quite a bit. And so yeah, I just took that. That was the first card in the house of cards. And once that came apart, it kind of gave me the freedom to like try to explore the rest of Christianity and figure out if there were things that I could glean from it that I really liked, or if there was still a lot of issues that I had with some things. And, probably to no surprise, there were still many things I had an issue with afterwards.
Yeah.
Um, and to be clear, I don't know that I would probably, well, that's not true. I do know. I would probably not consider myself a Christian at this point.
Mm,
Um, I do feel like that there's probably some parts of Christianity that I mean, I still love the person of Jesus. I still think that the way he lived his life on earth was remarkable.
mm,
Um, but to believe that the Hebrew God is the only one,
mm.
or the right one, there's just really very little evidence to support it. And, it just makes us one more in the number of people who believe their religion is the right one. And
Mhm.
so, um, I am a very spiritual person, but I have departed from Christianity and likely never to return.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that the hell card is a pretty big card to start with in terms of
Yeah.
deconstruction. I mean, I feel
Hey,
like
we just
most
went
people
all the way
start,
in.
yeah, most people start a little lighter. But like going knee deep into hell, I mean, it's unsurprising that like the rest kind of like followed after that. It's
Yeah.
one of the big ticket items, to be fair. But I think, you're talking about sort of morality. One of the bigger things I've found is when people realize that actually you can have morality without the Bible. Like, if the Bible is the only reason you're not going around murdering, like, stealing and lying and all of those awful things. If the Bible is the only reason you're not doing that, then we've got a whole nother problem at hand.
Also, and also keep reading your Bible because
Yes,
like
absolutely.
you don't need you going around killing people because you couldn't read the Bible.
No.
Just keep
Yeah.
reading it. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean that's and that's the part where I think the church has done a really good job of
Mm.
othering and separating. And
Yeah.
so there's this like there's the church people and then there's the world, right? There's always this black and white like
Yeah.
line.
Mm.
And I think once you step outside the church
Mm.
and you're like, oh my God, there's actually good people out here.
Yeah.
Well, that kind of like messes up everything. It kind of like screws up this whole they will know we are Christians by our love. Give me a fucking break. Like I've experienced more love from non-Christians than I have from Christians.
Yeah.
So explain that. Explain that.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And I have probably experienced much more hate from, Christians than I have non-Christians. So, like,
Absolutely.
yeah. I mean, in terms of, morality and values and all of those sort of things that, it's what drives the way that we live our life. What was it like for you to reconstruct and create what your value system was outside of what it was supposed to be?
One of the phrases I've used pretty often is that my exit from Christianity freed me from the feeling like I had to be perfect.
Mm,
And so the phrase was, if I don't have to be perfect, maybe now I can be good.
mm,
And the reality is that um, as I was kind of contemplating like what's important to me, um, it really kind of came from my experiences with people who are modeling and displaying similar things. So like and the truth is that obviously we've talked about the Bible not being the sole owner of moral goodness or what is called moral goodness. But the reality is that there are things that society agrees on that is morally good, and there are things that are in several different religions that are all kind of correlating the same thing. Like we have these basic human truths that um killing people is wrong. Like there's just obviously there's some really big ones, but then like the fine-tuned ones are um have you ever experienced compassion from somebody and how did that make you feel?
yeah.
And so if you experience that and or even like deep empathy,
Mm,
the people that would come and like sit in the mud with me,
mm,
um, that was like, okay, well, do I have to say that like you have to do that with people in order to be considered a good person? I don't know, but I know that's how I want to show up in the world.
mm,
And so there might be aspects of my lifestyle now that people would say would make me a good Christian.
mm,
The difference is that I'm just not doing it in order to earn my way into heaven.
mhm,
I do those things because I really truly believe in, I mean, I don't want to say I'm Buddhist, but I feel like there's so much from Buddhism that I've really just really loved. And
yeah,
part of that just comes with this idea of reducing or eliminating suffering in humanity, because I think it's something that we all definitely experience, we all go through, and we all have wildly different outcomes from our own suffering.
mm,
But I do know that deep levels of compassion and empathy, care and love are things that I haven't met many humans that would reject those things if they were offered them genuinely or authentically.
yeah,
And so, I'm so blessed and thankful that when I went through my season, there were like two people that like showed up in my life and they just did it. Like they did the work. They did the work of sitting with me And ironically, they weren't my therapist. I wasn't paying them. I did pay a therapist, and he did a really great job with that as well.
Yay,
Um,
good. We love good therapists. I was
yes.
like, oh, please don't say they're a shit therapist.
No, no, not at all. Like I will tell you this. I really do in all of this, I will say that if you have incredible, incredible friends, maybe the necessity for a therapist is a little bit less. Probably not, but maybe. But at the very least, we do live in a world where if you don't have the friends that can sit with you and walk through things and point out to the dark spaces and be comfortable in your mess, you can pay somebody to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And you should,
Yeah.
because the reality is that if you're left alone in your own mess,
Mm.
you will likely succumb to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we are creatures that were made for connection. I truly believe that.
Mm-hmm.
And so really the work now has been like um those two people were so incredibly impactful to my life. It feels like I've been rescued like I thought a savior would,
Mm.
but just by some regular people.
Mm-hmm.
And um yeah, it inspired me and motivated me to like be that person
Mm.
for others because ironically we're in a time where this is happening a lot. Like I am not an anomaly.
Mm.
My experience of the church and religion is not one of hundreds or even one of thousands.
Mm.
It's one of hundreds of thousands.
Yeah.
And so there are people that are experiencing the loneliness and the abandonment and the suffering.
Mm.
And not everybody has somebody that will come and sit in the mud with them.
Yeah.
And so that's really how my process has progressed. And there are some spiritual elements to it. Like I do believe in quite a few different spiritual reasons to be that person for somebody. But the reality is that this just seems like what humanity is about for me,
Mm.
is the ability to care, love, connect, empathize, and be compassionate and kind to the people that are around me.
Yeah. It makes me, and I'm hoping that I'm going to say this right, but it makes me think of the little like tagline that you have in your bio, which is to be vulnerable with safe people and to be safe for the vulnerable. Is that right? Did I
Yeah.
get it right?
Yes, you got it right. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I mean, what impact has that had for you to be able to be that person for other people?
It's definitely something I'm very passionate about. And I think one of the reasons I'm so passionate about it is because of the fact that it's incredibly rare.
Hmm.
It is so rare to
Yeah.
find safe people when you're feeling vulnerable.
Mm.
And it is incredibly rare that once you feel like you have done the work and have become somewhat of a safe place, to find people that are willing to be vulnerable,
Yeah.
because most of them are guarded and defensive and have had a lot of experiences with unsafe people.
Yeah.
And so, um, this really started when I started doing my podcast, and um, essentially, there's a lot of deconstruction podcasts, so many great ones, and everyone has kind of like their own flavor, etc. And there was parts of me that's like, I knew there was a few things I wanted to stay away from, and there's no, I'm not dogging on anybody that has different flavors to their podcast, but I knew I didn't want anything political.
Yeah.
To me, it's just not something that's important to me. I mean, I do care about it, but just not in that particular space. There were also a lot of people that were having podcasts that were just shitting on the church the whole time, and like that's all it was. And I'm like, okay, well, like, cool, like maybe that helps some.
Mm.
And so I'm like trying to navigate like what I wanted to do. And it just kind of occurred to me that I was like, there are so few podcasts in the deconstruction space that are just simply the therapy work of holding space for someone's experience.
Yeah.
And so that was like primarily what I wanted to model in these podcasts because and I'm not a therapist either. So like I'm not trying to do therapists work.
Yeah.
But what I do want to show is that even as friends and as fellow human beings, we do all have this ability to be able to sit and hold space for someone's experience
Mm.
in a way that has nothing to do with whether you agree with what they believe or
Yeah.
not. I've had people on the podcast that are very, very much Christian. I've
Mm.
had atheists on the podcast. I've had very, very normative heterosexual white people. I've had people of color and queer, affirming and queer individuals on the podcast as well. And so, like, the idea wasn't like, I don't really care so much about like, um, what you belong to. It was more just like, hey, we're all human, and that means that we all possess this ability to actually just sit in the mud, to
Yeah.
just to say, listen, if this experience caused you grief, let me just grieve with you.
Mm.
And it's not because I want you to go to heaven. It's
Mm.
just because I had witnessed that myself. And
Mm.
I witnessed the experience of feeling safe and felt and heard and seen and loved. And if I'm not showing up in the world that way, which obviously I'm not going to do it perfectly, but if I'm not dedicating at least some of my life to that experience, then I feel like I've just become a consumer.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, that's really kind of where that came from, is just recognizing that as I started doing this, people's responses were pretty consistent.
Mm.
And they were like, man, Brady, you seem like a pretty safe place. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm not. Like, I'm a mess. I'm just like everybody else. The difference is that I'm just trying. And I just wanted to paint the picture that we could all do this.
Mm-hmm.
Still go see your therapist, but like, the more people we have in this world that are able to contain and be a container for the emotions and experiences that people go through, because the reality is that if you are human, that does also mean that you get a life of constant pain, constant work,
Mm.
and a constant sense of uncertainty. And so those three things alone will send you into this like, hey, maybe I shouldn't do this by myself.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think, I mean, it's one of the things that I say even to my clients, which is like, I'm just as human as they are, even though I'm sitting in the therapist position in that setting. But I think one of the things that, like, as you're talking about holding that space um, and there being, a multitude of different podcasts and all of that sort of thing, is that there is also an element of the space that you're creating that is like smashing a stereotype as well, which is the fact that you are a straight, white, cisgender male who is being the person holding that space, who we expect to not be holding that space as well. Like there is an element of that as well. We often equate the person holding space and being a container and being a safe person for someone as being a woman. Like that's, I mean, it's the stereotype that churches push as well, is that the woman is the nurturer, right? And so there is an
Mm.
element, I think, that as, the opposite of that, that is kind of breaking that barrier of gender stereotypes and gender norms as well.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I do think that it is one of the things that we might have the most broken in our society is
Yeah.
men, in the general sense, men's emotional awareness and sense of emotional maturity and their ability to I mean, like it's I don't know, it is outrageous, honestly, the way that men have just in general, obviously, there's always exceptions, but just in general have responded to emotion by suppressing and repressing.
Mm.
And, I think we're getting better. I mean, I don't know. I think compared to 50 years ago, I think we're doing a lot better.
Yeah.
Um, but at the end of the day, uh, the reality is that, gosh, men suck. And I say that as a man. And I don't want it to be that way, but I
Yeah.
do recognize that. I mean, you've heard this, the man or the
Well, the
bear. I
man
mean,
or the
like,
bear.
yeah. And have
Yeah.
you heard this, the men fight back with the woman or the tree? Have you heard about that one?
No.
Yeah, it's so outrageous actually. Um, but there's one that's like woman or a tree, at least the tree would hear everything that I had to say or something like that.
Oh,
And so I'm like, the fact that we're like actually developing this language where it's actually very, very easy to see that in our society and in this culture, we are so terrible as men at cultivating and tending to the parts that are us,
Yeah.
the emotional part of things, the connectedness to our bodies,
Mm.
that's actually really crazy. Like men and the connection to their bodies is like non-existent.
Mm.
It is purely like gratification on every level. It's
Yeah.
like you're hungry, you eat a huge meal.
Mm-hmm.
You start to feel those emotions that you don't want to feel, have a few beers. Like
Mm-hmm.
everything is set up in order to make a man more comfortable.
Yeah.
And the reality is that all that does is lead you into a lifetime of disconnection.
Yeah.
And so if you don't have disconnection with yourself, how in the world could you possibly have disconnection with others?
Mm.
And if you don't have disconnection with others, then like what is life?
Yeah.
Um, and so yeah, I don't mean to shit on men, but I am definitely very upset and like concerned with the
Mm.
general sense and lack of emotional maturity in men today. And I think the worst part about it is I think it's actually worse in the church than it is outside of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Do you feel like, whilst you've sort of been deconstructing religion, do you feel like you've also been simultaneously deconstructing masculinity and
Oh, yeah.
patriarchy? Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'll tell you one of the main reasons for it. It was actually really weird, but it was also like, here's the cool thing. I told you that like I left everything all at once.
Mm-hmm.
The cool thing about leaving everything all at once is like, who the fuck cares? Like, there's no one left to judge. And so
Yeah.
like you can literally like you can actually step into real authenticity because like who cares?
Mm.
I don't have a church elder telling me I'm doing the wrong thing. I don't have a spouse telling me I'm doing the wrong thing. I don't have friends telling me I'm doing the wrong thing. I can literally just figure it out for myself.
Yeah.
Now, I made some poor decisions, so I didn't do it perfectly, but I learned.
Mm-hmm.
But part of the weird thing for me, which I just did not foresee coming, is that in that season of life, and even to this day, um, almost all, I would say 90% of the connections and friendships that I have are with women.
Mm.
And I'm like, well, that's weird, right? Like that's like growing up the way that I did. I'm like, the only reason you would be a friend with a woman is if you wanted to marry her, what
Mm-hmm.
stuff like that, like awful. But then I was like sitting here thinking, like, but wait, this is where the healing has happened in my life.
Yeah.
There have been a few women that have come along and have been kind and nurturing and compassionate without any expectation for some romantic relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was confusing because I was like, wait, this is something I'm not supposed to be doing. And it's not supposed to be having a good result. It's supposed to be having a bad one.
Mm.
And so I guess part of that really did lead to the deconstruction of the patriarchal system as well, just simply because all I was looking at was men not showing up and women showing up.
Mm.
I'm like, wait a second, why are men in charge? Like, why are men running this
Why
if the
are
women are
men in
doing it so much
charge?
better? That's what I'm saying. Like, it's kind of ridiculous. In fact, there was even so many times where like you have to listen to it. There's a podcast episode we did on the patriarchy and in the church.
Yeah.
Um, but one of our conclusions was like, we have this conversation about equality for women, and I'm like, I'm getting to the point where I'm like, I guess I'm a feminist because I'm like, I don't
Mm.
know. I'm pretty sure a woman would do that job way better than a man would.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, it's just, I really do think it comes from this willingness
Mm.
to actually feel.
Yeah.
And unless you feel, you can't heal. And so you're just walking around with a lot of men that are purposefully and intentionally, maybe subconsciously, choosing not to feel.
Mm.
And so when I started to kind of like see this unfold and like recognize the friendships and connections that I had that were primarily female, um, it just made it really easy to like kind of be like, man, I don't know why men think that men are so great at this point. Like I'm not really like I used to think that because I was one of them and I was like trained to think that way. But now
Yeah.
I'm just like, I don't really see what we see in ourselves, to be honest.
Mm. Yeah.
And again, not to shit on men, I just think that men have a long ways to go in accepting responsibility for their behavior, for their lack of willingness to navigate emotional difficulty. Um, Go to fucking therapy. Like
Mm-hmm.
the way that men will resist that is absolutely absurd.
Yeah. Yeah, they really do. Like it's we I wish I could disagree with you. But I can't because like even as a relationship therapist, even getting men through the door for relationship therapy is difficult, and also it's only ever because, the wife is making me come, like, right? So it's
Yeah.
always yes. To summarize that, men go to therapy.
It's true. Well, and here's the cool thing too. Like, I think some of the fears that men have are just inaccurate. And, that happens sometimes. We have fears over things that we just don't know anything about. And so it's the fear of uncertainty, really. But I think what I found too is that one particular friend in that season, I would confide pretty heavily sometimes, and I would just be like, man, I feel so out of place
Mm,
because of the way that I'm just like going through and like labeling and describing these emotions that I'm feeling. And I'm just like vomiting all of these feelings onto her. And at the end of the time, the conversation when we would like kind of get through them, I would just be like, "Ugh, I'm so sorry.
yeah.
I I immediately felt like too much. I felt like a mess.
Mm,
And she had such the kindness to just be like, Brady, this is okay. Like,
mm,
you're allowed to feel things.
yeah.
And actually, the fact that you're willing to feel them and to describe them, label them, and talk about them,
Mm,
that's a strength, not a weakness.
hmm.
And so I was like, wait, what? And so I expected rejection and instead found encouragement and acceptance.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of times, I spent 30, a little over 30 years believing that my emotions would end up making me undesirable or rejectable.
Mm,
Why do I feel that way? I don't know. I mean, it's obviously the system, right? Like the way that we were born and raised. But this is why I do the work that I do because I do want, I mean, everybody, but also men to be like, hey, there is actually a level of safety that you can have in your emotional vulnerability.
yeah.
And actually, we kind of need it. Like, quit shutting that shit up because we actually kind of need it. Also, if you have kids, they need it too.
Hmm.
Um, the level of attunement that you can offer to a child that can radically change their life, fucking important. And you
Yeah.
definitely can't do that if you can't even label your own emotions.
Yeah. I mean, if we shift gears, because I feel like
Yeah,
otherwise that's going to derail the conversation, because I feel like we could keep talking about it.
sure.
But if we shift gears into, like you've mentioned a few times, that like there is still like a core spiritual part of who you are, what does that spirituality look like now post church?
Ooh, that's a great question. It's been a couple of years now, so like I feel like I should have really good answers for you, and I don't, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But I will describe like what my experience has been so far.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I do feel like there has been enough experience in the last couple of years post church that has left me feeling like I could never reject the idea of the divine. Like
Mm,
I really absolutely do believe in the divine.
mm,
Um, and it's not because there's this like romantic idea that the divine cares about me, and it's not because like uh, I needed $50 this week and $50 showed up on my doorstep, kind of like the church would like say God is real by those types of displays. So it wasn't that either. Um, but there was just like, I don't know how to describe it other than to say deeply in my core, I just know
mm,
there is something about my experience that tells me that there is intimacy in the divine
mm.
with the divine somewhere in me.
Yeah.
And so, obviously like I've done exploring, like I've looked at different religions, gods, and like tried to find one that like matched my own experience of how I thought God was.
Mm,
That didn't really like come up with anything super great. Um, but one of the things that has actually been a very prominent thing that just will not go away and is only getting louder
mm,
is that my experience of the divine is almost always amplified tremendously in nature.
Mm-hmm.
And so, uh, is it possible that it's the Hebrew God? Sure. I don't know.
Yeah.
Um, what I think personally is that even the Christian Bible and the Hebrew God is some human's depiction of what their experience with the divine was. Well, why can't I have my own?
Mm-hmm.
And so personally, I believe the divine is feminine, maybe masculine as well, but I feel like I experience more of the femininity of divine nature than I do masculine.
Yeah.
Um, and so like when I hear people talk about the earth as being God, and I think about then they talk about earth being her, and I'm like, I can't really disagree with any of that in my own experience.
Yeah.
I kind of feel like Pocahontas a little bit right now, like just in the sense
Yeah.
that I'm like talking to willow trees now or
Colors of
whatever.
the
But
wind. Yeah.
yeah, like, but
Uh,
as crazy as that sounds, at least in my experience, I do feel like there has been
mm,
more of a resonation internally with that Pocahontas song than any worship song I sang at church.
mhm.
And so there was one night, there was one experience. It was in April of this year where I was out in the woods late at night, and it was very still, and the moon came out, and the trees were just everything was like serene and immaculate. And I remember thinking like, I don't know, an overwhelming sense of there is something,
Yeah.
and whatever there is, it is here in these woods, in this, not in a particular location, but
Mm,
um, it was just I felt the presence of the divine caring. And
mm.
so sometimes I'll call her universe, sometimes I'll call her earth, sometimes I'll call her divine, sometimes I'll call her the force if I'm talking to a Star Wars nerd. Like, I don't know. Like it doesn't really
Yeah.
like the name doesn't really matter to me. It's just that my spirituality has actually only ever grown
Mm,
in my ability to connect with myself.
yeah.
And so yeah, I actually feel more spiritual now than I ever did in church, which is really weird. But
Hmm. I mean, I think I always think it's funny because I always preempt that people, when I ask this question, people are going to bring up nature. Um, it just is, what happens. And I just think it's so funny that churches still think that the slippery slope towards leaving church is like sex, drugs, and, rock and roll or queerness. But actually, it's nature. Nature is the slippery slope out of church because a lot of the time you do feel much more connected to yourself and to the world around you. And I mean, and that's kind of, when people ask me, how do you define spirituality? It's connection inward and outward, whatever that
yeah.
looks like. Um, but it makes me think of the Maggie, who is the host of the Hello Deconstructionist podcast,
Yeah.
and she says that for her it was God is a woman and that woman is me, and I love that because it's kind of coming back to that you can often connect outward when you connect inward. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, and I also believe in the symbiotic nature of everything. Like it is actually ironic and insane the fact that whatever we are,
mm,
we're dependent.
yeah,
Like at the end of the day, I can't live life without the oxygen that comes from trees.
mm-hmm,
Um, I can't live life without water that comes from streams and rivers. Like the reality is that it is actually a very symbiotic relationship because also I have the ability to wreak havoc on Earth. And
yeah.
so in order for me to understand that and not say that it's spiritually significant just seems wrong to me.
Part of what I love to do with these episodes is to reclaim language that I think for a long time we felt like the church, or particularly evangelical Christianity, owns. And spoiler, they don't. Um, but what brings you, present day, November 2024, what brings you joy and peace?
Uh, the list is endless, which I love, but if I had to summarize, it really is connection.
Yeah.
The more that I connect with myself, the more peace I feel.
Mm.
The overflow of that being connecting with others is what really where the joy comes from.
Mhm.
Um, and to think that we're doing that connection, we're creating that connection with Earth. It's a very co-creative experience.
Yeah.
And so as far as like, reclaiming language, if there's like one part of Christianity that like I really do want to reclaim and use in a way that I'm passionate about, it's intimacy.
Mm.
Intimacy is one of those things where like, which by the way is not sex, right? Like maybe a part of it, but like the actual general sense of intimacy is this closeness of
Yeah.
this I see you, you see me.
Mm.
And the intimacy is like um like if you ever have somebody over at your house, like even if it's a really, really close friend, there's still that like one area of your house that you wouldn't show them. Like you wouldn't like if they see it, okay, maybe, but like I'm not gonna go like display it for you. Like that's my closet. Like
Yeah.
or maybe it's a drawer. Like as close as you can get with somebody, there's still in our human nature this desire to close off parts of us.
Mm.
And for whatever reason, like
Yeah.
obviously I'm not going to go like take a stranger into my bedroom and show them my underwear drawer. Like I'm not trying to do that. But what I'm saying is that we have this idea that if I'm at least 70% vulnerable, it's enough.
Mm.
But like intimacy is when it's like I can be comfortable and sit with all of you,
Yeah.
and you can be comfortable and sit with all of me. And
Mm.
so like part of my experience that brings me so much joy and peace is that there has just been a couple of people that I have either accidentally or purposefully shown them the darkest parts of me.
Mm.
And they didn't go running.
Yeah.
Like they didn't just like give up. And so um to me that feels like intimacy where you can say, I see you, you see me, we connect, we're holding space, we're viewing each other, we're
Mm.
present, we're intentionally present in the present,
Mm.
and that is enough. And it just feels sacred to me. And so it's kind of like the experience that I always wanted with the Christian God, but never got. And there are, I've even told, like I told my parents the other day, I was like, I hope there's like one or two friends that I was talking about. And with one of them, I said, I really hope Jesus loves me like she does.
Mm.
And when I made that statement, it just hit me because I was like, oh, part of the desires in my heart is that I wanted everything that I was taught growing up to be true.
Yeah.
I wanted it to be true.
Mm-hmm.
And the freedom and the joy and the peace have come from the fact that it is true,
Mm.
just not from a deity. It's been in human connection.
Yeah.
And so if I were to say, if I had to really truly define my version of the divine, it's actually just in sacred human connection.
Mm. I think I'm coming up to about 12 months of recording for this podcast. And I think that that is the best answer anybody has given me to that question.
Thank you.
Oh man.
Uh,
And I think it's just I mean it's like real and it's beautiful and I think that yeah, I don't know. I don't want to say any other words to that. Okay, well, I love finishing these episodes with some encouragement for listeners. And so, what would you say to someone who is, they're in that 6 month window where you were talking about sitting in that suffering, they're fresh in their deconstruction, they've just pulled on that thread, and things are crumbling for them?
don't make the mistake of not going all the way.
Mm.
Like if you're already in this place where you are tearing things apart, don't leave stones unturned. Like don't make the mistake of doing it half-heartedly or going because see that's the hard part about suffering is that if you're going to experience it but not in its totality, you're just saving some for later.
Yeah.
And so I'm not telling you that like you have to deconstruct all of Christianity all at once. It's obviously not what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Um, but if you're actually granted the gift of being able to deconstruct anything,
Yeah.
use it. Like, have that moment where you can start to navigate and establish and reconnect with your intuition, with your heart. Because if you can do that, that's a slippery slope. Like, it will just continue and you'll keep doing that. But I think the worst thing you could do is to go through that experience and to endure the suffering, but then to leave it incomplete.
Mm.
Because I've seen that happen a few times where people will exit the church, they'll deconstruct a little bit, they will freak out, and for a good reason, and they
Yeah.
will go running back to the church.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I don't have a problem with the church, but I care very much so about the fact that there's a reason you left in the first place, and that's because something in your true nature was screaming at you that it didn't feel okay.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, just in whatever that looks like to you, and whatever that way is, do it fully, like do it all the way.
Yeah.
And I think if you do, the cool thing is that once you tear it all down, like you can build it back up.
Mm.
You can say, hey, you know what? I don't believe that Jesus is divine. You can say that,
Mm-hmm.
which is a scary thing to say because you're like, oh, that's like instant hell, right? Like,
Yeah.
oh my God, like that's blasphemy. I'm for sure never getting forgiven now.
Yeah.
But who's to say that if you are willing to allow yourself to believe that for a moment,
Mm.
that you can't just go back and say, you know what? Actually, I was wrong. I do actually believe Jesus is divine.
Mm.
So you get what I'm saying? Like you always have this ability to reconstruct things you've torn down. The problem is going to be is whenever you tear down this building 80% and you leave some really shit bricks at the bottom and then you start building on top of it, it's all going to fall down again.
Yeah.
And you will chase another religion, or you'll chase another form of acceptance, or you'll chase another adrenaline rush. Like it'll always be something. So yeah, that would be my biggest piece of advice is just like if you're going to do it at all, just do it. Like do it all the way.
Mm. Yeah. I love that. And I think, often when we do it all the way, we are left with, the most core part of who we are at the end of it. And then we get the ability to build whatever that looks like from the most purest part of ourselves.
I would rather be authentically wrong
Mhm.
than to be inauthentically right.
Yeah.
Because at least in one of those, I have me.
Hmm.
And I know that when I have me, I have a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah. It allows you to cling on to, irrespective of whatever is crumbling around you, it gives you a groundedness and a centeredness in yourself and in your inherent goodness, which just might oppose what you've been taught, but it's still.
I can't believe this. I might actually be good from birth. My goodness.
Who knew?
Uh,
Well, I mean, on that note, thank you so much for joining me. I've loved this conversation.
Truly a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Beyond the Surface. I hope you found today's conversation as insightful and inspiring as I did. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with others who might benefit from these stories. Stay connected with us on social media for updates and more content. I love connecting with all of you. Remember, no matter where you are in your journey, you're not alone. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep moving forward. Take care.